Hello and welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we're going to be looking at Unit 8.2, the Cold War. Our learning objective is to explain the causes and effects of the ideological struggle of the Cold War. And we're going to do some claim development, sourcing, other skill practice as well. So here's a look at the standards. Right, and we're also going to explore the non-aligned movement a little bit today. Okay. All right, so and there's going to be a little overlap from the last video, so I apologize for that. All right, so looking at the Cold War, the post-World War II view from Moscow. All right, so 9 to 14 million Soviet soldiers killed in World War II. Somewhere between 8 to, estimates upwards of 20 million civilians killed in World War II, in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, Russia had been invaded by Germany twice in the previous 30 years. They're fearful. The Soviets are fearful of an invasion by the United States and England, similar to what had happened after the First World War. You even had prominent American generals publicly making statements, suggesting that since we already have our armies mobilized and in and in Europe, we might as well go ahead and take Moscow, and just, it was an inevitability anyway. So there were legitimate concerns or legitimate reasons why the Soviet Union might believe that an invasion by Western forces was inevitable. All right. So that all being said, let's work on our a claim, and let's do a sourcing activity. So assuming that the prompt is analyze causes and effects of the Cold War. So treat this like you would a DBQ, where you're being given a document. So try to create a claim that addresses the topic of the prompt that could, and have that claim so that it could be supported by evidence in this document. All right. So, a little more targeted claim development, not just one. So we're looking beyond simply just creating a claim. Let's now create a claim that can be supported by, with evidence from this specific document. Okay. So this is, right. And then once you do that, right, looking for a single claim, remember category of analysis plus skill application, right? So a single claim. And then once you do that, try to source this in one way. So, try to provide some historical context, try to, explore who the intended audience is, what the purpose of the document is, or maybe what the limitations or point of view of the document are. And we have a source here from, this is the Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov. This is from a radio broadcast to the Russian people, and this is done in November of 1947, so a little over 2 years after the end of World War II. All right, so go ahead and pause and do all that. And welcome back. So at this point, we're just doing this and, just kind of see how we're doing. We'll do a couple practice rounds, and then we'll do one for a homework or classwork. Good. All right, so maybe your claims, right? Something to the effect of Soviet mistrust led to a breakdown in the alliances that had been created during World War II, resulting in, in this increase in tension during this period known as the Cold War. Or disputes over status of these, Eastern European states, right, et cetera, et cetera. All right. Possible sourcing, right? Ways that you might be able to source this. Molotov attempting to rally the Russian people around the ideas that the Americans and the British were to blame for the coming conflict. Right, so, putting them in a position to show where they violated conference agreements like Potsdam, right? Because Molotov and Stalin are going to need support for the impending war to come. Or Molotov gives a speech as tensions are rising over control of Eastern Europe, This is shortly after the Winston Churchill speech, given stating, that an Iron Curtain had descended upon Europe. So there's increasing tension over this. So Molotov wanted to blame the British and the Americans for the tension, as a way to justify the establishment of, puppet regimes, right? And this is like a vocabulary kind of concept, right? So remember, when you do your sourcing, that you want to make sure that you're bringing in something that is not here to help us better understand who wrote it, the situation going on when it was written, why it was written, so you need to bring something extra to the document, right? Help us understand it better than what we could if we simply read it, so there needs to be that kind of outside information, brought into, this specific document. All right, so there's some sourcing ideas, right? And hopefully, one of these kind of matches up with what you did. All right, let's do another little sourcing activity here. So, post World War II view from Washington D.C. So hopefully you know who that is, right? So I don't think I've ever had a class that couldn't quickly identify that as Truman. So we do not want devastated nations to fall to the Soviet-backed communism. The post-World War II goals of the United States is economic reconstruction of Europe, military superiority, containment. So when we talk about economic reconstruction, in your readings, and of course you learn about this when you're younger, we typically think about things like the Truman Doctrine or the Marshall Plan. Hopefully you know what the Truman Doctrine is or the Marshall Plan is. If you do not, then look those up. Those are important concepts. We talk about overarching goals of our foreign policy, containing the spread of Soviet influence and containing the spread of communism. Eventually, this will develop to a kind of a more developed theory. Things like the domino theory. That you have to contain, and if you allow a single country to become communist, then it'll have a domino effect throughout a region. This is why you have to stand so firmly in support of the dictatorship in South Vietnam, for example. If South Vietnam falls, then Cambodia falls, and then South Korea falls, Japan falls next. The whole region goes. Right, so these are the overall goals, and kind of visions that you see coming out of Washington, right? So, all right, so let's do another claim activity with a sourcing activity, very similar to what we just did. All right, so this one here, once again, the exact same prompt: analyze causes and effects of the Cold War. So, of course, technically, your previous claim would work for this prompt, but we're trying to target this a little bit so that you can develop a claim that could be supported with evidence from this specific document. All right, so kind of a targeted claim writing activity, and then go ahead and source this. All right, so with all that being said, we have a speech made to the press, to the media in 1957. So we're 10 years after this one now, and this is by John Foster Dulles, the U.S. Secretary of State. There are a couple of things I want to just make sure you focus on as you read this. Right, one is this statement right here: events of the past year indicate. Right, events of the past year indicate. So what happened in 1956? Right, what happened in 1956? If you watched yesterday's video, let me give you a hint: blood in the water. Right, blood in the water happened. So if you know what that means, then you should be able to contextualize this document. But anyway, so go ahead and pause and do that, and I'll come back in a minute. All right, so welcome back. So hopefully you have a good claim now, or you think you have a good claim, and hopefully you have a good sourcing attempt. All right, so possible claims. American desire to contain communism to the Soviet Union, and then we see our scale application here. All right, or the United States and the Soviet Union both desired Allied countries for trade and military support. Right, the rivalry over allies, led to the Cold War, and really this is inferring NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Right, so we're seeing in this passage a building of support for those kinds of organizations. All right, possible sourcing. We see Dulles is appealing to citizens of the United States and allied countries, trying to show that the United States was attempting to spread freedom and Enlightenment ideals around the world. He did so that the U.S. would have more alliances with. So what you're seeing here with this one is there's a real binary choice being presented here by Dulles. Like, you are either with us or you are not with us, right? So what is the binary choice? These pressures of liberty. Soviet strength is being expanded to repress, right? The binary choice is this John Locke ideal of self-determination and democracy. And, if you are supporting what the Soviet Union is doing, then you are against that, right? So that's what you're seeing here with that one, right? And we see this, the second possible way of looking at this, that Dulles delivered the message to the press, knowing at the time, the mass media, that the message would be delivered to people around the world, and especially in Europe. You could even kind of go into the fact that there's a radio-free Europe, and that, this message could have been given for the media, knowing that it would be broadcast in West Berlin and received everywhere in East Germany, everywhere in those Eastern Bloc countries would have been able to receive this message. Or another possible sourcing is if you talked about what happened, the events of 1956 and what happened in Hungary, right? That's what that's referring to, is the events in Hungary. So this is being given at very, very specific time. All right. So let's talk really quick about the events of Hungary and the events of 1956 in general, not just in Hungary. But when you look at this, understand that we are not talking about Stalin's Soviet Union anymore. Remember, Stalin dies in 1953, and we have a new leader of the Soviet Union who is firmly in place by 1956, and that's Nikita Khrushchev. All right. So, and I always kind of like to ask, what is he holding on to in this image from 1957? Hopefully you know what that is. All right. But when you talk about Khrushchev, just a couple things about this is, when Stalin dies in 53, you're going to see uprisings break out in places like East Germany. When you look at what happens in 1956, in Hungary and in Poland and even within the Soviet Union of Georgia, what happens is partially in reaction to Khrushchev. Khrushchev gives this very famous speech in 56 where he denounces Stalin, right? And this is a big deal. Stalin was the state for decades. And when Khrushchev denounces Stalin, his cult of personality, his purges, his actions, right? So as soon as he does this, you're then going to immediately see a pushback against Stalin's other policies, like what happens after the war in the Eastern Bloc countries. So this is one of those things where Khrushchev is denouncing Stalin, and then people are going to test him on that. How far do you mean? How much of Stalin's policies do you question? And so Hungary's going to put Khrushchev into a situation where he needs to decide: is he going to maintain the policy towards the Eastern European countries that Stalin had, or is he going to allow them to have some independence in what they do? So Khrushchev ends up making the decision to repress what happens there and to kind of maintain the status quo in the Eastern Bloc countries. But a lot of things internally in the Soviet Union do change, right? There is a loosening up of a lot of things, especially economically, right? Kind of a lot of economic reforms, and a lot of cultural reforms. Right? As far as kind of the bigger things to come out of this, or at least what I kind of make sure my students in class make sure they hit, is one of the biggest impacts of this denunciation of Stalin is it creates the foundation of the rift between Mao Zedong and Khrushchev. So we'll often talk by the late 1950s of a Sino-Soviet split. Sino means Chinese, right? Sino-Soviet split. And a main part of the reason for this is in 1956, while Khrushchev is denouncing Stalin, Mao in China is going full Stalin, right? He is advocating the collectivization policies. In agriculture of Stalin, he's advocating the 5-year industrialization plans of Stalin. So at a moment when Mao is going full Stalin, Khrushchev is denouncing Stalin, right? And that's going to, I have heard it said that is what creates the kind of the underpinning of the Sino-Soviet split, right? And then there's some other things that happen, but that's a major wedge between the two. One other kind of thing to note here is that the publication of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, right, is a big deal because it's Alexander Solzhenitsyn who we get Gulag Archipelago from, and we get the very first uncensored publications of what was going on inside Stalin's Russia. People knew that there were camps in Stalin's Russia, but the extent to which the gulags was a shock to the Western world, right? So the atrocities of the Stalin era. All right. So, but Khrushchev, right, for all his reforms internally, he will not survive the Cuban Missile Crisis. He will, in the immediate aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, he'll be ushered out of power. All right. All right. So, but what I want to kind of really get at today also is the non-aligned movement. So when you look at the map of the Cold War, in NATO, in the Warsaw Pact, the non-aligned movement is the global other. It is the rest of the countries, right? Either as member countries or as observer countries, right? And I was kind of like looking at the non-aligned movement by looking at George Marshall, right? And this is the same Marshall from the Marshall Plan Marshall, and General Marshall at the time when World War II ends. He spends the next year after World War II ends in China, as an American liaison for Chiang Kai-shek's China, and he makes a lot of observations. And when he comes back, from China, he makes this observation. It's a very well-known quote, right? We are in the middle of a world revolution, and I don't mean communism. The revolution I'm talking about is that of the little poor people all over the world. They're beginning to learn that there is in life. They begin to learn what there is in life, and to learn what they are missing, right? So what Marshall is seeing here, right, in his time in China, is that you've got a couple 100 billion people at this time who live in China. A couple 100 million people who live in China at this point, most of which are still living as peasants, by this point in time. And he brings up an interesting question, right? That the world is not the same as it was, before the wars. And, what's going to happen when this very large percentage of humanity begins to realize what life is like out there, right, in Europe or in North America? How's that gonna go? So when you talk about the 1950s, right, obviously the Cold War is a big thing, but you also see you have like French demographers coming up with this idea of first world, second world, third world, right? And what does this mean? First world is the capitalist world, second world is the communist world, and the third world is the global other, right? So, and of course, this is a French demographer, so they have in mind, the French Revolution, right? The Third Estate. And, what does the Third Estate do to the First and Second Estate, right? Eventually, right, you need to kind of make those connections to what people are thinking in the 1950s. And of course, part of what's giving a lot of this credence in the 1950s is non-aligned movement, right? So, when the non-aligned movement begins, technically, I guess, formally in the early 1960s, 61, but it really begins in 55, right, in the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, right? And we see here some aims: promote goodwill, cooperation amongst nations, in Asia and Africa. Consider socioeconomic cultural problems in relation to the countries represented. Consider problems of special interest to Asian and African peoples. Problems affecting national sovereignty, racialism, colonialism, and to view the position of Asia and Africa and their people in the world of today, right, and the contribution that can be made in the promotion of world peace and cooperation. Right, so right, this, like I said, eventually becomes the non-aligned movement. So this is, but the 55 conference was hosted by Sukarno, right, the president of the the newly independent Indonesia, been independent for about half a decade at this point, and at this conference they're going to provide the basic framework for what becomes the non-aligned movement. And when we talk about the non-aligned movement, and you can see here, it's Indonesia, it's India, Nehru of India, right? So Tito of Yugoslavia, Nasser of Egypt, right? And Nkrumah of Ghana become our founding members of what becomes the non-aligned movement. And when they meet in Belgrade in 61, they'll all attend. All right. All right. So these are the principles that come out, right, of Bandung. And if you kind of pause and read through these, they're nothing too shocking today. So go ahead and do that real quick. All right. So I would like to point out, though, that like when you look at number 3, recognition of the equality of all races and the equality of all nations, large and small, just keep in mind that this is in 1955. And I mean, this is literally 1 year after Brown versus the Board of Education. Most schools in the United States, are still under some kind of segregation, at least in the southern part of the United States, right? So, you understand the context in which this is coming out in. All right. There's an interesting perspective on this conference. This is a book written by an American, Richard Wright. And if you don't know who Richard Wright is, he's a journalist. He's an African-American journalist living in Paris at the time. He reads about this conference in the paper, and so he decides to report on it, right, to travel there and to report on it. So he goes, and then he eventually ends up writing this book, right? And you can kind of preview this book on Google Books or wherever. You can read about 30 or so pages. If you read through about 30 or so pages, then I don't think you'll get to the point where he actually goes to Indonesia quite yet. It's all kind of the pre-planning of his trip. But yeah, it is an interesting read, very interesting perspective, that he does bring to the table on this. All right. So anyway. So we're going to do another claim, and this one will be collected, I guess. All right. So once again, the exact same prompt, analyze the causes and effects of the Cold War, but just with a different one. We're looking to source this one as well. All right. So this is a speech by Sukarno of Indonesia, right, to the Bandung Conference, a gathering of leaders of newly independent countries in Asia in 1955, Asia and Africa 55. War may mean the end of civilization and even of human life. There is a force loose in the world whose potentiality for evil no man truly knows. What can we do? We can do much. We can inject the voice of reason into world affairs. We can mobilize all the spiritual, all the moral, all the political strength of Asia and Africa on the side of peace. Yes, we, the peoples of Asia and Africa, 1,400,000,000 strong, far more than half the human population of the world. We can mobilize what I have called the moral violence of nations in favor of peace. We can demonstrate to the minority of the world which lives on the other continents that we, the majority, are for peace, not for war. And that whatever strength we have will always be thrown onto the side of peace. So go ahead and write a claim that addresses the topic of the prompt that you might be able to use this document as evidence for. And then please source it in one way with a so what statement as well. All right. So this will be, if you are watching this at home, please email this to me. I'm just going to go through a couple other things, maybe help you with your sourcing on this. So, and then we'll come back and I'll show it to you again. All right. Just kind of keep in mind a few things, though, just about non-aligned, in case we don't get around to talking about this again. It sounds like it's a big force, right? And theoretically, it should have been a big force. But why haven't most of you heard of it before? And of course, part of this has to do with, the realities of the diversity of the group. So the diversity of the group, meaning the religious diversity, the ethnic diversity, the racial diversity, the ideological diversity of the group. And in the 1950s, there was a glue that held them together. The glue of resistance of European imperialism and opposition of European imperialism. But by the mid-1960s, most of the imperial possessions of the Europeans had been spun off as independent states. And so without the glue of resistance of European imperialism, we're going to see, the non-aligned movement, become marginalized. And we're also going to see primary members of the non-aligned movement actually go to war against each other, as early as the year after the Belgrade meeting, right? So the Chinese-Indian War, the Chinese-Vietnamese War, right, 79, Cambodian-Vietnamese War, basically all the 1980s. The Indo-Pakistan War, 65, 71, right? Bangladesh genocide of 71. You're going to see you're going to see a lot of evidence of the erosion of the unity that had once existed. Just about Sukarno in Indonesia, just so you have a little bit on him, right? So Indonesia, if you look at Indonesia, extremely diverse place. Right, so extremely diverse place. 200 major languages, ethnic groups, very large Christian, Buddhist, Hindu minorities. Had been a Dutch colony, right, since the 1800s. It was conquered, right, by the Japanese in 1942. Japanese conquer, throw the Dutch out, right, and then they established 3 military districts. The elites who worked for the Dutch were absorbed by the Japanese. So when World War II is done, the elites who had administered for the Dutch and then the Japanese, they will largely flee, right? So that kind of administrative class is gone. Sukarno will claim independence, right? Same as what happens with Indochina, with Ho Chi Minh, by the way, right? The Dutch decide, like the French, that they're going to reclaim their territory. The Dutch do well militarily against the insurgency, but they'll lose politically. They're not able to establish a stable political order, and when they're forced to get support from the United States, Truman says no, right? So so we're going to see Indonesia, will be the Dutch's hand will be forced, and they will leave in 1949, most of them anyway, or most of Indonesia anyway, and Indonesia will become independent. Problems. Right, same issues the Dutch had maintaining control, right? So, the diversity of it, the decentralized aspect of the islands, right, make it a problem to kind of fully unify. Sukarno, he'll take aid first from the United States, then he'll take aid from the Soviets, then he'll take aid from the communists in China. Sukarno was more than willing to use Cold War tensions to whatever advantage he could. All right, so the U.S. worries about the communist financial ties. So in 65, we're going to see a military coup. Sukarno will survive this, right? Fears of communists may take over. And then there's going to be a second military coup that is successful, and this is going to result in the rise of Suharto. Right, so Sukarno is replaced by Suharto. Suharto is backed by the United States. Right, and will be in power from 65 to 98. And we see a series of anti-communist purges that result in the establishment of a new order. Somewhere around 500,000 people are killed in the first couple weeks of 1965 of this new regime. Another 1.5 million are going to be imprisoned. And it's a major purging of the ethnic Chinese minority that live there. Keep in mind that... right, since Unit 1, we've been talking about diasporic merchant communities, and one of the very first diasporic merchant communities was Chinese in the Malaccan Straits, right? So, why is there a Chinese ethnic minority that lives in Indonesia? Because for the last 800 years of this course, we've been talking about diasporic merchant communities, all right? All right, so anyway, Suharto, regarded one of the most corrupt rulers of the 20th century, Suharto and his family alleged to have embezzled, right, mass quantities of money, right? So, but he does maintain a stable regime. He keeps the communists out of Indonesia. The Green Revolution, which we'll talk about in Unit 9, enables the population to explode, right, to grow, and is a pretty reliable regime for the United States. All right, so anyway, that's a little Indonesian history there for you. All right, so please make sure you create a claim. A single claim is all I'm looking for, right? Category of analysis plus skill application. And source this document in one way, and please email this if you are at home. All right, so some key takeaways from today. Non-aligned alignment strategy proved instrumental in fashioning a compelling position for newly independent nations caught in the Cold War and the superpower tug-of-war contest of the loyalties of new nations. So an attempt to find a third path, an alternative to choosing either the U.S. or the Soviet Union, and stress the struggle against colonialism, against racism. The primary goal is to maintain formal neutrality. Right? Shortcomings, suffers from a chronic lack of unity amongst its members, ultimately failed to present a genuinely unified front, and theoretically non-aligned was either Cold War superpower. Many member states have close ties to one or the other, and the situation caused dissension within the movement. All right, that is all for today. Sapriati.